Now I give the floor to Daniel Chiquiar from Economy of the ITAM. Bachelor degree in San Diego University, researcher in economy in private and public sector as well. Public sector, he has worked as General Director of Economic Policies in the Department of Treasury in 1997. Last years he has been in the Bank of Mexico as a researcher, and in the past and at present he is Director of Economic Measurements at the bank. And above all, I wish to thank INEGI and ITAM for the invitation to participate in this such important seminar. During my presentation, what I will be doing is first to talk about, I think that's Ernesto's. So first, I'm gonna give you some comments on why is it important to have the measurement on productivity in an economy, and in general in all economies, but especially in Mexican economy. To move forward and give some comments on the productivity measure that results from the efforts made by the INEGI and that they are presenting throughout this CALMS project. And lastly, I'm going to wear my jacket of researcher and I'm going to briefly show to you the kind of use that we can give to the information that has been published by INEGI from a much more analytical and academician way. So first of all, why is it important to measure productivity in an economy such as the Mexican economy? And in order to answer this question, we have to see what has been the economical performance of Mexico beyond what is the growth in its at international competition level. Regardless of how difficult it is so difficult to explain it, but it is well known, it is not new, that Mexico has been illy assessed on terms of competitiveness. We know that the last measurement, Mexico ranked 55 among the 148 countries, in contrast with Mexican market, because Mexican market is not the one that of an economy that will be ranking 55. It is larger, though. We clearly know that the ill assessment that Mexico has had in this type of index reflects issues that have been attributed to different kind of rigidity, distortions, or institutional problems that lead Mexico to be not to be considered as a competitive country. So if you see the global competitive index and the different pillars that define it, Mexico has had some improvements in terms of development of financial market infrastructure, the same size of market that our economy is representing. It has been improving at a global competitive level, but there are many things that can influence the economy negatively, like efficiency in the labor market, institutions that drive economic productivity in the markets of goods, in competition, among others. So then we ask ourselves, what is the issue behind Mexico and how can this be related to what we are discussing in this seminar? Well, given the previous remarks, Many would have heard that the Bank of Mexico has been insisting in the fact that in order for Mexico to have a better growth, in order to increase life levels in the Mexican citizenry, needs to increase competitiveness. Competitiveness is a very difficult concept to define. There is not a consensus in the definitions. Sometimes Paul Krugman even said that it is a concept that makes no sense economic-wise, but to give you a certain sense in terms of could be practical from a viewpoint of doing economic politics, is that this concept of competitiveness would be linked to two aspects of the economy. One, to achieve high productivity translated into high levels of production because of the factors that the economy has, and a better use of the country's advantages and a good allocation of resources, wise allocation of resources. A better and efficient assignment of resources is translated when you measure it in better productivity. And in better productivity, as we have already seen during other presentations, it's an element that has a direct link to quality of life. Let's recall that empirical and analytical literature has linked the group of Latin American countries to a problem of productivity and not accumulation of factors. There's a lot of literature to this regard. So that is why it is important to measure it the best way possible. And here is where we can include the topic that we are discussing today. So precisely the fundamental message that results from the data that INEGI is presenting to us today is that Mexico has growing underneath of what would imply the accumulation of factors that we have had. If only with the accumulation of factors, we could achieve the same growth of the weighted addition, growth should be high enough what we have observed. That is why the residual, and then I will be making an assertion according to residual, is negative. That is to say, we are not even growing at the rate of what the addition of factors could lead us to do. So, on that sense is I welcome the new measurement of productivity for Mexico that the INEGI has undertaken. It has very important advantages over the other measurements on productivity of the past, because in the way that we are measuring, and that is important, we measure it as a residual that comes from discounting productive measures and adjusted because of their quality. The new productivity measure deriving from the INEGI figures is the residual of growth once that we have discounted contribution of accumulation of capital adjusted in a certain way by its composition in IT and in reserve of seeing the methodology for quality. The labor is also measured at a human capital level, because we are measuring by schooling, by gender, by educational level, but perfectly we are doing it not only because of the accumulation of knowledge, but this can make much more precise productivity measure that we are reaching. Another merit of the INEGI that has already been mentioned is that this information is being presented at a much more detailed and a much more broken down level. So all this effort is welcome, and as I will be showing to you in a few moments, it can be very useful to have a more detailed analysis of the Mexican economy, and in the future to design new public policies. Even though there are some comments to make to that regard. And first is the definition, and this is quite important because even if we measure factor productivity by a residual, because that is the way that we can measure it, since we don't have direct information on factor productivity, and we do have a production productivity level. It is calculated as a residual, but its interpretation should not be residual. That is to say, interpretation of factor productivity should be an element that contributes to growth beyond or underneath, in our case, the accumulation of factors. But it should not be interpreted that growth has been low because of the accumulation of factors, then our residual would be negative. On the contrary, what we need to say is productivity has been a hindrance for growth because we have not reached the growth rate that we have been expecting because of public policy, or whatever you want to say, that had driven to a bad productivity or bad growth of productivity in Mexico. So first of all, it should not be interpreted as a residual. That is the way how we calculate it, but not how we should interpret it. We need to consider that with an accurate measurement on productivity, it is not fully measuring its fundamental contribution to economic growth. Let's think about a very simple exercise that is very well known in the academy. We can do the breakdown as INEGI has done in order to calculate in what in accounting exercise it contributes the accumulation of factor. But accumulation of factor is not endogenous in economy. Investment. A much more productive investment could lead to more investment in the economy, and therefore not taking that into account, because it's difficult to take into account, could underestimate the impact it has on economy. Part of its effects will be measure of accumulation of more capital, and the same can be applying to other factors on the economy.
There's another element that Felipe mentioned in detail that not necessarily adjusts to changes in the inputs in the economic cycle, and these productive measures, well, you see these swings throughout the cycle, especially when you have a crisis such as the one in Mexico in 1995, or the recent global recession. Despite the fact that there may be an economic explanation for this or not, it would seem that to be able to have a more long-term perspective for the economy, we would need to understand the effect in changes in the use of the inputs in the on the lower part of the economic cycle, because that doesn't necessarily indicate a loss of productivity. Well, taking this into account for the relevance of its relevance for the Mexican economy, we have what was published by the INEGI. We saw it this morning, and the first thing that caught my eye is that except for the rebound in 2010, which was born from the 2009 drop, which is not necessarily a productivity loss and nor a gain in productivity in the rebound, well, we see something very serious, that the fact that the only period from a long-term perspective in which Mexico was had positive growth in its factorial productivity was in the years right after the NAFTA went into effect. And removing this, well, let's see another graph. That's not the PF from the CLEMS, but something more traditional. Actually, well, let's look at this. Let's check this out. If we take the KL, if we take measures for different sectors in the world, or I mean different regions in the world, and this is the most traditional one factors, which are capital and work, or labor. But you'll see that this is not different to what the INEGI published. The only episode in which Mexico not only grew or surpassed the other countries, but surpassed itself as well in terms of its historical performance and the performance that came afterwards was in the years right after the NAFTA. So it's not about me doing a dissertation here about why this happened. Yes, productivity is related to the NAFTA and what happened afterwards. Here we can see it was a huge, well, there was greater competition from China, and we lost ground to them, and Mexico didn't adjust efficiently to this and was able to present negative growth and productivity. There's an element that you need to read in terms of INEGI's data, and when we've been able to grow more efficiently and when productivity has not been an element for growth. That it's taken place because of accumulation of factors. So I'm comparing the PFT in comparison to the data of the INEGI with what we would have measured with KNL, and you can see that it's very similar. Actually, the serious part here, and the PFT on average measured by the INEGI is lower. So when we adjust to a greater number of factors, it turns out that the growth and productivity, or what we're able to read in terms of the data from the INEGI, is that it's even more pessimistic than what we previously saw. And initially it was very pessimistic, so in terms of Mexico's productivity. So in this sense, I think it's very important that we exploit this information because it's fundamental information, and in the future, as Felipe mentioned and Jordi suggested in his presentation, it's very important information when it comes to evaluating or understanding why Mexico hasn't grown at the rate it should. In this sense, we'll now present a very preliminary work that derives from the academic agenda that me and my colleagues at the Bank of Mexico have followed for several years now. Just to give a brief introduction, for many years we have been worked to try and explain why Mexico, if there was a period in which Mexico had a relatively favorable performance, it was in the years right after the NAFTA. And why did this last so little? Why did, since 2001, we went back? We fell back, and this has to do with our increase in exports, which was the result of the NAFTA. However, we have also argued that this window of opportunity was not exploited enough, so that when other competitors, in the case of China, because of its size, is quite relevant, but we lost market share, and this led us to a negative situation once again. So something that we had discovered in previous research, and I'm just going to hop out to the next slide here, is that there is a behavior in Mexican exports to the U.S. that is congruent with competitive advantage theory. So if we take for two relative periods, first the one of the NAFTA, and then once China entered, but we see a positive correlation in the comparative advantage of Mexico for each sector with regards to China and Mexico's exporting capacity to its market. So in areas in which we're more competitive in terms of our comparative advantages, sectors in which even though China could have beat us, we had a better performance than in areas in which we don't have a competitive advantage. Why do we have a competitive advantage in some sectors and not in others? Well, that's a question. We've tried to identify if Mexico's comparative advantage with regards to China is determined by, say, the relative series of factors of its history or of its more Ricardian history, the relative productivity of some sectors that makes us more competitive than in other sectors. So up to now, it was difficult to identify Ricardian competitive advantages, especially dynamical ones. In previous work, we had tried to identify with TFP measures and statically how much this could help explain our competitive advantages. However, we had never, in a very precise fashion, we'd never been able to measure how the increase in the productivity of certain sectors with regards to others could lead or be the engine behind our exports. So with INEGI's data, we can do it now, and we can see it in this graph here. So what we have here is a correlation between Mexico's export performance in comparison to China and productivity growth published by the INEGI for different sectors of the economy. So there's a great correlation. So even when China started gaining the upper hand, sectors in which our productivity was growing faster or dropping slower were the sectors in which we had a relatively superior performance in terms of our exports with regards to China, especially in areas where China started to openly compete with Mexico. So there seems that there's a history of competitive, a Ricardian history of competitive advantages. So once we take the factors per sector, this indicates that's an important factor behind our performance. This is very preliminary. It hasn't gone through the even minimal testing, but we've gone back with this data, and what we discover is when we include total factorial issues as a factor of our of the factors for our exports competitiveness, well, this factor is bigger in the NAFTA, and it gains statistic importance above the competitive advantages as part of our exports advantages. So there is a Ricardian history, and we've been trying to locate this, and with data from our multifactorial productivity, we're going to have a greater field to identify the information we want to estimate. So just to finish, I'm very happy to have this published by the INEGI, and it gives us great mileage in terms of better understanding of the Mexican economy. I just would like to add to what's been requested in this seminary. The INEGI needs to publish on the databases used, the technical coefficients for each sector. So the more information we have in this sense, the more we'll be able to export this in a useful way, not only for a better understanding of the Mexican economy, but also to create public policies that can enhance this performance in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel. Now I will introduce, he's the General Director of Productivity at the Ministry of Finance and Taxes, of the Revenue Service of Mexico. He was in charge of the program for democratization of productivity in the National Plan of Development for 2013-2018, and before working for the Revenue Service, he was at the Inter-American Bank of Development. He was lead economist for Mexico, and he also worked at the International Financial Corporation of the World Bank. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Berkeley and a master's and in economics and at the ITM, as well as his degree. He's published in peer-reviewed journals, especially when it comes to subjects related to business environment and the impact of social and economic integration and other subjects. First, I'd like to thank the INEGI for participating in this forum and ITAM for its hospitality. I'm going to describe the agenda for the federal government to increase productivity in an inclusive manner, and this is part of the program for the democratization of productivity. I think these were very interesting presentations. The one I heard, maybe this one won't be as interesting, but INEGI's data will. We are some of the first users of the information of the INEGI, which it's been very helpful for us. This is the order of my presentation. I'll tell you a bit of a program, why it's important to democratize productivity. We'll check the diagnosis of the factors that have affected productivity in Mexico and what the program proposes to give attention to them, and a quick description of the productivity agenda where I would try to suggest some ideas, some of which are consistent with what has been already mentioned on the use that can be given to the information from the INEGI. So I think this scheme, Francisco Guillem in his presentation, he mentioned this briefly. The National Plan of Development, aside from the 5 chapters in which gives attention to the 5 national targets defined in this government, includes 3 crossover strategies. One of them, which is of a modern government that works closely with them, a gender perspective as well in public policy, and the third one that has to do with democratization of productivity. I'd like to underscore the cross-cutting nature of this, because when we think of productivity and public policies to increase productivity, we tend to think or refer to policies to develop medium-sized companies and small companies or investing in innovation. However, the cross-cutting nature, and this is what we try to capture in this program, it says that this needs to be reflected in the different areas of public action. For instance, in the chapter of Mexico en Paz, or Mexico at Peace, in which speaks of the government's agenda in terms of safety and security, and it speaks of companies, and that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that aside from the direct effect of these policies on the well-being of people, there may be other effects on people. The National Plan for Development shows that one of the principles that need to be followed by the companies is how to elevate productivity, and government programs must aim to increase productivity in regions, sectors, or a segment of the population. Why make productivity more democratic? Well, I would state that first, the word democratization may sound strange in this context, but I think it merely means or refers to inclusive growth, as we tend to as is done in several international organs. Something that is evident is that we have a serious growth problem in Mexico. It's much lower than in East Asia, but even lower than in Chile, Peru, or Colombia in recent years. Another important thing to underscore, highlight, is that growth is not an objective in itself. It has direct implications on the well-being of people. We try to illustrate this, showing the correlation between the change in reduction of poverty. Well, there's a correlation. This is just to illustrate, but we have studies that, international studies that support this, and the fact that growth contributes to poverty levels and to increase the level of life of the population. So why do we grow? This audience is quite evident. I'd just like to underscore that we can grow, whether through accumulation of factors or capital, or through our growth in our efficiency, meaning in increased productivity. And something important to mention is that this not only occurs if we elevate efficiency within companies. An important effect of the reassignation of productivity factors to greater productivity, well, from low to high productivity areas, but it can also be done within a sector of less productive companies to more productive companies. For instance, a problem we see in Mexico is that informal companies take in great amount of resources, and since they are not productive, this reduces the productivity of the economy as a whole. And what evidence shows in the case of Mexico is that the main factor, this is also for the rest of Latin America, explaining the poor performance in terms of growth of these companies, of these economies, is that, well, this graph reflects accurately what Daniel mentioned a moment ago. The relative income of Mexico in relation to the U.S. This goes from 1960 to 2010, and it decomposes the evolution of the relative growth, which is inferior in recent years to what it was in 1960, and two factors in the accumulation of relative factors between the economies of the U.S. and Mexico and productivity. The accumulation of factors in itself with regards to the U.S., it would have increased the income level in the U.S. They have more schooling, higher investment, demographic tendencies are positive. However, what the red line says, which is productivity, is to pull down these benefits which would have resulted from accumulation, and this would have led to a gap, an income gap in Mexico with regards to the U.S. This is consistent with several studies. There's an interesting study from Chantal Clip and other researchers, and they compared China, Mexico, India, and these factors are the main factors that increase productivity. And what they discover is if these factors would have been assigned efficiently, the productivity would have been growth. The Inter-American Bank for Development also studied this and published a report in 2010. In preparing this program, we were lucky enough to have information from the INEGI based on the CLEMS methodology, which, as Paul mentioned, is state of the art when it comes to measuring productivity. And we also spoke of some of the more technical discussions. Why do we observe drops in the cycle that are relevant? But for practical effects, perhaps the most valuable part of this is that for the first time we have in Mexico a way of measuring productivity made by a credible institution that's autonomous from us, and which allows us to create a diagnosis and measure our advances in this sense. And having access to this information was not lucky of us. Not only it was not a fluke. We applied the program in the 31st of August, and INEGI accelerated this so we could have access to it before the publication and be able to use this data. So what do we think has affected the productivity of Mexico? Well, we first classify the different factors in four groups. This can be different. Each group is not exclusive, but it allows to fix certain concepts. The way in which these factors have been distributed in Mexico has been inefficient. The informal economy is an issue. 60% of Mexican workers are in the informal economy, according to the INEGI. Informal companies are about 45 less productive than the formal ones. So, and this is according to Santiago Levy, a researcher at the Inter-American Bank of Development. We also have a problem allocating capital factor, and they have the companies have limited access to banking, loans from banks and credit. Only 15% have access to credit, according to a study, and less than half have access to financing from the banks. So there are a great number of companies that don't rely on banks. So we go beyond capital which are the factors that we usually take into account. So there's other issues to consider in terms of land in the urban environment. For instance, cities of Mexico grew in terms of surface between 1980 and 2010, eight times, whereas population grew twice. And this is a reason of concern because urbanization allows us to agglomerate. Companies research and greater productivity. It's a centrifuge pattern of growth, and it goes against this concept in Mexico. In our program, we also mentioned environmental degradation. And INEGI had great information on this. The cost of environmental degradation is higher than 6%, and Paul Schrader's comments were very useful for this on how we need to adjust our productivity measures to consider this environmental degradation and the use of our resources. I think there is a terrible use of a good percentage of our resources. Water, for instance, if we give subsidies to electrical companies to extract water from aquifers, this is leading to a poor use of water. Subsidy of energy is also a clear example of this. The second group of subjects has to do with the factors that affect the productivity of workers, of companies, and of productivity issues in farmland. There's there's poor investment in terms of labor in this area. There is poor education. The productive and the educational sectors are separate, and there's a recent study comparing the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. Whereas in the U.S., companies that are 40 years old and new companies are 8 times. In Mexico, it's only twice, meaning that in Mexico, once a company overcomes obstacles, they face several other obstacles when it comes to their growth. And this can include access to financing or the informal economy, or also the not having access to proper staff and innovation, but also mismanagement at the corporate level, as someone mentioned in one of the previous sessions. Now, the government of Mexico spends quite a bit of money in promoting small and medium companies, but what we see is a dispersion of programs that are not articulated between them, and this forces us to think ways in which we can follow adequate policies in this. In the case of agricultural production, there's pulverization of the land, and there's no access to basic raw materials such as fertilizer, etc. In innovation, only 0.4% of the GDP is invested in this, and it's done by the public sector. In the rest of the OECD, it's 2%. And so it's very little of this money is invested by the private sector, so it inhibits its growth. The rest has to do with cross-cutting issues on investment. And well, although at the federal level we've taken substantial steps in improving our regulatory framework, there continue to be problems at the municipal and local level that make it difficult to create formal companies and maim their possibility to grow. I was mentioning insecurity at the beginning of my presentation. According to numbers from the World Bank, the effect of criminality on companies in Mexico passed from 15% 2006 to 30% in 2010, and the cost to companies as victims and also the measures they need to implement to do this, to protect themselves, is 3%. So this is taxing on the companies, and a preliminary exploration would indicate that it affects the most productive companies. So insecurity affects productive companies, so it needs to be attended. The concentration of markets and lack of competition in sectors that provide raw materials such as transportation and energy and telecommunications is another factor that we should not lose sight of. In terms of infrastructure, we think there has been a divorce between our investment and our productive apparatus at the regional level, so we should not lose sight of this. And when it comes to other factors and of internationalization, well, we've made steps forward, but companies do not participate in global supply chains. It's very few companies exporting in Mexico, so we need policies aimed at these companies, and we need to facilitate their participation. And the fourth subject had to do with factors that avoid a sectorial participation in Mexico and that have led to the persistence of gaps and industries. So what I can see here, and I didn't mention this previously in the graph, where we have the INEGI data. Well, we created an index based on growth rates, an index in which, well, productivity for 1990 equals 100, and we see that during this period the productivity has contracted 8.2%. So what we have here is, well, we're comparing it to our sectorial behavior. And what's quite worrisome about this is that there are sectors, such as the commercial sector, in which productivity has dropped way above the average of the economy, and they employ a great amount of resources, 1 out of every 5 workers. It's not perhaps it's not very clear, but the width of the bar is a GDP for each of these sectors. In 1993, commerce, for instance, represents 10% of the GDP in 93, and also it dropped 15%. 1 out of 5 workers is in the sector. So the conclusion you read is that in general terms, the behavior of productivity in these sectors of high employment has a very important effect on the aggregate productivity of the economy, and we need to attend the causes of this.
This graph, the advantage of the INEGI data, as has been pointed out before, is the degree of breakdown it has, or the segregation for the index that we produced. Here we have the 66 undersectors or subsectors. I think that we're missing one, and we are showing, and maybe you can see it here, that productivity for most of them, it has dropped. Only 13 of the subsectors we can observe increasing productivity, as you can see on your graph. It is telling us that there is a generalized problem at industry level, but it's still talking about the specific in each one of them. The contrast, even inside the manufacturing sector. Overall, it is unaltered, but we have contrast cases as transportation, whereas accumulated productivity in the period increased almost 18%, versus clothing sector, where accrued productivity dropped around 30%. What productivity program is doing is proposing objectives and strategies at a general level in order to respond to these problems. 5 objectives that correspond to the diagnosis that I showed to you previously, except for number 5 that I will be explaining further on. And for each one, it proposes actions, specific actions. First, we emphasize on formal job creation. Here we highlight the importance that the labor markets work efficiently, that public policies do not foster informal jobs, and all that has to do with the contributions with social security services, and have access to credits at the banking level, and the way to sponsor technology research. And it is also important to have a sustainable development in the suburb areas. And all this would be managed efficiently. Regarding productivity of workers and companies, we highlight the importance of human capital, especially in households of low income, and this goes all the way to early development of thoughts and having education, promoting an entrepreneurial attitude, training at work. Mexico invests very little, much less than any average country of the OECD. So these are processes at a long run. We have to see the importance of articulating properly public policies to foster management, innovation, and on the rural side, articulate public policies and the expenditures, which is very high, so producers can have access to proper inputs. Regarding business, we have highlighted that the base to construct productivity is to maintain macroeconomic stability, but we have to move forward in increasing competition in key sectors, link a productive sector, make integration of chain values in the companies. On the regional side, first, the act has to do with promoting a structural change. Promote that the resources of the economy move towards more productivity sectors at the same time that we are supporting traditional sectors such as agricultural and trade to convert and create a space in order to use productive policies that are addressing specific sectors or industries, but be very careful in not falling into this kind of income policies. We need to move forward that raise productivity and that they do it inclusively. At a federal level, there are tasks. We constructed a productivity committee that we believe must be reinforced. There are interesting experiences like in Australia where their committee reviews that the public policies are aligned with productivity, and the states, according to the new federal labor law, have to create these commissions. The states that do a lot of promotion activities have to be aligned to this agenda. To summarize, this is only the productivity program, overall idea, but this has to be brought down. The different programs are being put in place, and we are assuring that this sector plans of agricultural secretariat, among other secretariats, will really be aligned with the productivity, and that we are all moving in the same direction. But there is an agenda of work that will be quite intensive. It is very important to say that we have a need to go in depth on the analysis, on the study of problems presented by specific regions or sectors of the economy. And there is where having available INEGI's information will be great. Personally speaking, I think that, and maybe taking into consideration some of the things that have been said here, why haven't we been able to have a structural change in our country? We have information on changes on productivity. Maybe we need to have levels of productivity, especially at the beginning, and see if employment has been growing on sectors with more productivity and how this has been moving or why it hasn't been occurring. Why we observe this huge drops on high employment sectors like trade. A topic to be considered should be that to the extent that informality could have been growing some sectors, as some studies show, this has had an impact on productivity. Integration to global economy topics, as Daniel was mentioning, they seem to me are very important because at the end of the day, in order to compete in international markets, it has to do everything with increasing productivity. So I do believe that this information will provide us the possibility of analyze the effects on ICTs, on productivity. Quite interesting, and I mentioned it, what Paul Schreier was saying about the use of natural resources, because once again, I do believe that that's an area where we have to move forward. We need to understand how measurement is affecting productivity, but how it is affecting also the effectiveness of the economy. Something that for the first time the National Development Plan is asking us is to have indicators in order to reach our goals. So one of the indicators that we will be using is an index of productivity of factors that comes from the information produced by INEGI. I highlighted because I have a clear example of how this information will enable us to measure and to be improving our public wealth. I leave this on the screen. I'm not going to enter in detail, but we hope that we can revert the drop on total productivity of factors, and to 2018 we can have a rate growth of 1%. And I would like to conclude my presentation by thanking INEGI, all the support, the preparation of productivity program. I am sure that we can count on the INEGI. Mexico counts on the INEGI. That's their logo, and without any doubt this information is very valuable. And regarding to the questions that have been asked before about Mexican productivity, additional efforts have been made by the INEGI. Now they have a lab of data that is available to the researchers so they can use micro information, so we can really go into the gritty, nitty detail and analyze the effect of informality of companies or what is the impact on productivity. This information is very useful and is complemented and can be used more wisely thanks to this wealth of information that INEGI possesses.